It all started with a simple mistake. I wasn't the type to snoop through my wife's phone, but that day the universe played a cruel joke on me. Amy had left her phone on the bathroom counter while she took a shower, and as I walked by, it buzzed with a new message. The screen lit up, casting a soft glow in the dim room. I don't know what made me pause. Maybe it was the late hour, or maybe it was the name that appeared on the screen. David. I knew David. He was one of Amy's coworkers, someone she'd mentioned a few times in passing. The message preview was just a few words, but they were enough to make my heart stop. Can't wait to see you. I stood there frozen as the shower continued to run in the background. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I knew. You don't send a message like that to a colleague unless there's something more going on. I wanted to burst into the bathroom, confront Amy right then and there, and demand an explanation. But something held me back. Instead, I slipped out of the room, my mind reeling. I couldn't just accuse her without proof. I needed to know for sure before I did anything. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the message over and over in my head. By morning, I had made a decision. If Amy was cheating on me, I was going to find out. And if she was, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The next day, I started making plans. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed resources, tools, and a way to investigate without raising suspicion. That's when the idea hit me. I had always been good at reading people, at figuring out their secrets. Why not put those skills to use? So I opened a detective agency. On paper, it was just a small business, something to keep me busy. But in reality, it was a front, a way for me to dig into Amy's life without her ever knowing. I started gathering information slowly and methodically. I attended every work event and every social gathering where her friends and colleagues would be. I became the perfect husband, supportive and attentive, all the while listening, watching, and gathering clues. It didn't take long for me to find what I was looking for. They weren't careful. I followed them after work, watched as they met in secret, and documented everything. The lies, the betrayal, it was all laid out before me, undeniable and crushing. But I didn't confront her, not yet. I had something else in mind, something that would hurt them both as much as they had hurt me. And that's how it all began. With a single message, a single moment of doubt, that led me down a path I never thought I'd walk, a path that would ultimately destroy everything I held dear. It didn't take long for me to slip into my new role. By day I was still Jack, the loving, dependable husband who brought Amy coffee in bed and listened to her complain about work. But by night I was someone else entirely. I was the man who knew her every move, the man who could feel the walls closing in on her, even if she couldn't. The first few weeks after discovering the affair were surreal. I'd go to work, come home, and pretend everything was fine. Amy had no idea that every time she left the house I was right behind her, tracking her every step. I learned to blend into the background, becoming a shadow that neither she nor David noticed. It was at one of those work events that I finally made my move. Amy had told me about a company dinner, something casual that spouses were encouraged to attend. I knew David would be there, so I made sure to be the perfect gentleman. I shook hands, smiled at all the right people, and paid close attention to the way Amy and David interacted. They were good, better than I expected. To the untrained eye, they were just colleagues, maybe even friends. But I knew better. I could see the way their eyes lingered just a bit too long, the subtle touches that most people would overlook. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. As the evening wore on, I made sure to find myself alone with David. He was at the bar, ordering a drink, when I sidled up next to him. We exchanged a few pleasantries and talked about work, sports, and the usual nonsense. Then, as casually as I could, I mentioned Amy. She talks about you a lot, I said, watching him carefully. Says you're one of the few people she can really trust at work. David's smile was polite, but I could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Yeah, Amy's great. We've worked on a few projects together. She's very talented. I nodded as if this was just idle conversation. You know, it's funny. Sometimes I wonder if she spends more time with you than she does with me. He chuckled, but it sounded forced. Just work stuff, you know how it is. Of course, I said, letting the silence hang between us for a moment. Then I leaned in slightly, dropping my voice. But we both know it's more than that, don't we? The look on his face was priceless. For a moment he froze, his smile faltering. But he recovered quickly, too quickly. I'm not sure what you're implying, Jack. I met his gaze, my expression hardening. I think you know exactly what I'm implying. And I think it's in both our best interest to keep this conversation between us. He tried to laugh it off, but the tension between us was palpable. I didn't say anything more, just held his gaze until he looked away. When he finally did, I knew I had him. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it would only grow from here. That night after we got home, I watched Amy as she slept. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. But I knew better. The evidence I had gathered was undeniable, and now, with David on edge, it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. In the days that followed, I ramped up my investigation. I hacked into Amy's email, her social media accounts, and anything that could give me more information. I wasn't looking for just any evidence. I wanted something concrete, something I could use to destroy them both. And I found it. There were emails, photos, and plans for secret getaways. They weren't as careful as they thought, and I was able to piece together the entire affair. I printed everything out, organized it into a neat little folder, and stashed it away in my office. The power I felt holding that evidence in my hands was intoxicating. I wasn't just a victim anymore, I was in control. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand just yet. I needed to be patient, to let the tension build until it was unbearable. Only then would I strike, and when I did, there would be no escaping the fallout. For now I played the waiting game, biding my time and watching as the walls began to close in around them. They had no idea what was coming, no idea that the life they had built on lies was about to come crashing down. And I would be the one to bring it all to ruin. I bided my time, carefully orchestrating the downfall that was about to unfold. Every day I watched Amy and David grow more comfortable in their deception, unaware that I was tightening the noose around their necks. They thought they were safe, that their secret was well guarded, but they had no idea how close they were to losing everything. The moment I had been waiting for finally arrived on a rainy Thursday evening. Amy had texted me earlier in the day, saying she'd be working late again. I knew better. My sources had already informed me that she and David were planning to meet at a small, out-of-the-way restaurant on the edge of town, a place where they thought no one would find them. I let her leave without a word, pretending to be engrossed in my work at home. As soon as she was out the door, I grabbed the folder of evidence from my office and headed out. My heart pounded in my chest, not with fear, but with the anticipation of what was about to happen. I was ready to confront them, to show them just how deep they had dug their own graves. I arrived at the restaurant just before their meeting. The rain was coming down hard, blurring the lights of the city outside. I parked my car a block away and walked the rest of the distance, the folder tucked under my arm. The cold rain soaked through my clothes, but I didn't care. I was focused, determined, and ready to see this through. When I walked into the restaurant, I spotted them immediately. They were seated at a small, dimly lit table near the back, talking quietly over glasses of wine. Amy laughed at something David said, her hand resting on his. The sight of them together, so comfortable and intimate, sent a wave of anger crashing through me, but I kept it under control. I had to stay calm, had to make sure everything went according to plan. I walked over to their table, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet. They didn't notice me until I was standing right in front of them. Amy looked up first, her smile fading as she recognized me. David followed, his face draining of color as he saw the cold fury in my eyes. "Jack." Amy's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with shock. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled out a chair and sat down at their table, placing the folder in front of them. I could see the panic rising in David's eyes, but Amy was still in shock, trying to process what was happening. "What's going on?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. I opened the folder and slid it across the table toward them. "Why don't you tell me, Amy?" She hesitated, then reached for the folder. As she opened it and saw the contents, photos, emails, all the evidence of their affair, her hands began to shake. David leaned in to look, and I watched as the realization hit him. He was trapped and there was no way out. "I know everything," I said, my voice low and controlled. "I've known for a while now. I've been watching, waiting for the right moment to confront you both. And now that moment is here." Amy looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. "Jack, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." Her words felt hollow, meaningless. Sorry wasn't enough, not after everything she had done. I turned my attention to David, who was staring at me in stunned silence. "And you," I said, my voice hardening. "You're going to do exactly what I tell you, or I'll make sure your wife, your boss, and everyone you know sees what's in that folder. Your career will be over. Your marriage will be over. You'll have nothing." David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a man on the edge of a cliff about to fall. "Good. That's exactly where I wanted him." "I want you out of her life," I continued, my gaze locked on David. "You end this tonight and you never contact her again. If you do, I'll ruin you. Do you understand?" He nodded, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead. You understand." I turned back to Amy, who was now crying silently. tears streaming down her face. "And you," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. "You have a choice to make, Amy. You can walk away from this now, leave with whatever dignity you have left, or you can stay and watch as everything falls apart. It's up to you." She looked at me, her eyes filled with pain and regret. For a moment I thought she might try to explain herself, to beg for forgiveness. But then she simply nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I'll end it," she whispered. "I'll end it all." With that I stood up and walked away, leaving them to face the consequences of their actions. The rain was still pouring outside, but it didn't matter. As I stepped out into the storm, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I had done what I needed to do, and now it was out of my hands. But as I drove home, the reality of what I had done began to sink in. I had destroyed their lives, but in doing so I had also destroyed my own. There was no going back from this, no way to undo the damage. The revenge I had sought so desperately had come at a price, and that price was more than I had ever anticipated. The confrontation at the restaurant had left me numb. The drive home was a blur, the rain drumming relentlessly on the windshield, echoing the storm raging inside me. I thought confronting them would bring me some satisfaction, some sense of justice, but all I felt was emptiness. I had won, if you could call it that, but the victory tasted bitter. When I got home, the house felt colder than usual. I went straight to the kitchen, poured myself a drink, and sat at the table, staring into the darkness. My thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, regret, and confusion. I kept replaying the look on Amy's face, the tears in her eyes, and the fear in David's. I had wanted to hurt them, to make them feel the pain they had caused me, and I had succeeded, but instead of feeling triumphant, I felt hollow. The next morning, Amy was already gone by the time I woke up. Her side of the bed was cold, the sheets undisturbed. I didn't need to check her closet to know that she had left. I knew Amy well enough to understand that once she made a decision, there was no turning back. She was gone, and this time, it was for good. I spent the day in a daze, wandering from room to room, unable to focus on anything. The house felt too quiet, too empty. It was as if the life had been sucked out of it, leaving behind nothing but memories and the ghost of a marriage that had once been. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and keys and headed out, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get away from the silence. I drove aimlessly through the city, the streets slick with rain, the headlights of passing cars reflecting off the wet pavement. The city was alive, bustling with people going about their lives, completely unaware of the turmoil that was tearing me apart. Eventually I found myself outside a bar I used to frequent years ago. It was a small, nondescript place, the kind of bar where people went to disappear. I parked the car and went inside, seeking the comfort of anonymity. The bar was dimly lit, with a few scattered patrons nursing their drinks in silence. I took a seat at the far end of the bar and ordered a whiskey. The bartender nodded, not bothering with small talk, which suited me just fine. I wasn't in the mood to talk. I just wanted to drink, to drown out the thoughts that wouldn't stop swirling in my head. As I sipped my drink, I thought about what Amy must be feeling right now. She had lost everything in one night, her lover, her marriage, her sense of stability, and it was all my doing. I had orchestrated it, set the trap, and watched as it snapped shut. But in destroying her, I had also destroyed myself. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My revenge hadn't brought me closure or peace, it had only deepened the wound. I had become someone I barely recognized, consumed by anger and bitterness, and now, sitting alone in a dingy bar, I had nothing to show for it but an empty house and a broken heart. I downed the rest of my drink and ordered another, hoping to numb the pain, but no matter how much I drank, it wouldn't go away. The guilt, the regret, it all stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Hours passed, and the bar slowly emptied out. I sat there lost in thought, replaying the events of the past few weeks over and over in my mind. I had thought I was in control, that I was the one pulling the strings. But now I saw that I had been a fool. My obsession with revenge had blinded me, leading me down a path of self-destruction. As the bartender started to clean up, I realized I couldn't stay here forever. I paid my tab and stepped out into the night, the rain still falling in a steady drizzle. The city was quiet now, the streets nearly deserted. I stood there for a moment, letting the rain wash over me, trying to find some sense of clarity. But all I felt was loss. I had lost Amy, lost the life we had built together, and in the process, I had lost myself. The revenge I had sought so desperately had cost me everything, and now I was left with nothing but the hollow echoes of my own choices. I drove home in silence, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. When I walked through the door, the emptiness of the house hit me harder than before. Amy was gone, and with her, the life we had shared. I stood in the middle of the living room staring at the walls that had once held so much warmth and so many memories. Now they felt like a prison, a constant reminder of what I had done. As I collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion finally overtaking me, I knew there was no going back. The damage was done, and there was no way to fix it. I had set out to destroy Amy and David, but in the end, I had only succeeded in destroying myself. And there was no one to blame but me. The days after Amy left blended into a monotonous haze. Each morning, I'd wake up hoping it had all been a nightmare, only to be met with the cold reality of an empty house. The silence was unbearable, a constant reminder of the life I had dismantled. Every corner of the house held memories of us, memories that now felt like ghosts haunting me. I went through the motions, mechanically performing the tasks of daily life, but nothing felt real. Work became a refuge, a place where I could bury myself in tasks and numbers, anything to avoid thinking about the wreckage of my personal life. My colleagues noticed the change, but no one asked questions. I was grateful for that. The last thing I wanted was to explain how I had systematically destroyed my marriage. Occasionally I'd catch myself staring at my phone, expecting a message from Amy, a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was something left to salvage. But it never came. I had driven her away completely, and I knew that even if she did reach out, it would be to say goodbye for good. David was another story. After our confrontation at the restaurant, he had vanished from my life entirely. I had expected as much. He was smart enough to know that staying in contact would only make things worse. But there was a part of me that had hoped he would reach out if only to try and make amends. Instead, he had taken the coward's way out, disappearing as if none of it had ever happened. I spent a lot of time thinking about what I had done, trying to make sense of it all. I had been so consumed with anger, so determined to punish them, that I hadn't stopped to consider the consequences. And now, I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I had shattered. One night, about a week after Amy left, I found myself going through the folder of evidence I had collected. I had hidden it away in a drawer, thinking I'd never need to look at it again. But something drew me to it, like a moth to a flame. I opened the folder, spreading the contents out on the kitchen table, the photos, the emails, all the proof of their betrayal. As I stared at the evidence, it struck me just how meticulous I had been. I had cataloged every detail of their affair, every text, every secret rendezvous, as if building a case against them. But now, looking at it all, it felt empty. I had gathered all this proof, but to what end? The damage was done, and nothing in that folder could undo it. I found myself focusing on a photo of Amy and David, taken at one of their secret meetings. They looked happy, lost in their own world, unaware that I was watching. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Regret. Not in them, but in myself. Regret for the path I had chosen, for the man I had become. I knew that I had been wronged, that their betrayal had been real and painful, but in my quest for revenge, I had lost sight of everything else. I had become obsessed, consumed by the need to make them pay. And in doing so, I had paid the highest price of all. I sat there for hours staring at the evidence, trying to make sense of it all. Eventually I realized that it was time to let go. Holding on to this, to the anger and pain, wasn't going to bring me peace. It was only going to keep me trapped in this cycle of regret. The next day, I made a decision. I gathered everything, the photos, the emails, all of it, and took it out to the backyard. The air was crisp, with a hint of autumn in the breeze. I had always loved this time of year, the way the leaves changed and the world seemed to slow down. But now, it felt different, as if I was seeing it through new eyes. I set the pile of evidence on the ground and struck a match. The flames caught quickly, devouring the paper in seconds. I watched as the fire consumed the proof of their affair, reducing it to ashes. It felt cathartic, like I was finally releasing the hold it had on me. As the last of the paper burned, I realized that this was the first step toward healing. It wouldn't be easy, and I knew that the scars of what had happened would stay with me. But I had to move forward. Holding on to the past, to the anger and betrayal, would only keep me trapped in a life that no longer existed. In the days that followed, I started to make changes. I got rid of things that reminded me of Amy, slowly transforming the house into a space that felt like mine. It was a painful process, but with each small step I felt a little more like myself. I also began to seek help. I found a therapist, someone who could help me work through the anger and pain, to understand the choices I had made and how to move forward. It wasn't easy, opening up about the darkest parts of myself, but I knew it was necessary. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the loneliness threatened to swallow me whole. But I kept going, one step at a time, determined to rebuild a life that I could be proud of. The revenge I had sought so desperately had cost me everything. But now, I was starting to see that it was also a turning point. a chance to redefine who I was and what I wanted from life. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long time I felt like I could find my way. As autumn deepened, I began to feel a sense of peace. The wounds were still there, but they were healing, slowly but surely. And with each passing day, I was learning to let go, to forgive not just Amy and David but also myself. It was a long road ahead, but I was ready to walk it, and this time I would do it on my own terms, free from the anger and bitterness that had once consumed me. The turning point came about a month after Amy left. I was sitting in my living room, staring at the empty space where our wedding photo used to hang. I had taken it down in one of my many attempts to erase her presence from the house, but the emptiness it left behind was even more painful. It was as if a piece of my life had been ripped away, leaving a gaping wound that refused to heal. That day something shifted inside me. I realized I couldn't keep living in this limbo, stuck between the past and the future. I had to start moving forward, even if the steps were small and uncertain. The first thing I did was get out of the house. For weeks I had isolated myself, avoiding friends, family, and anything that reminded me of the life I used to have. But staying in that empty house, surrounded by the remnants of my marriage, was suffocating. I needed to breathe, to feel something other than regret and loss. I started taking long walks, exploring parts of the city I hadn't seen in years. It felt strange at first, as if I was seeing everything through new eyes. The parks, the streets, the people, they all seemed different, as if the world had moved on without me while I was trapped in my own pain. But gradually those walks became a form of therapy. The simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, of being out in the world, helped clear my mind and ground me in the present. One afternoon I found myself at a small cafe near the river. It was a place I used to visit when Amy and I first moved to the city before everything had gone wrong. I hadn't been there in years, but something drew me to it that day. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the river flow by, carrying with it the autumn leaves that had begun to fall. As I sat there I noticed a group of people gathered around a table, talking and laughing. They seemed so at ease, so full of life, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a pang of something that wasn't anger or sadness. It was a longing, a desire to connect, to be part of something again. It was then that I decided to start reaching out. I had pushed so many people away during my quest for revenge, but now I needed them. I needed to rebuild those relationships, to let people back into my life. It wasn't going to be easy. Some bridges had been burned, and I knew that not everyone would be willing to forgive or forget, but I had to try. I started with my sister Caroline. We hadn't spoken much since the fallout with Amy, mostly because I was too ashamed to face her. She had always been protective of me, and I knew she wouldn't approve of how I had handled things. But she was family, and I needed that connection now more than ever. I called her that evening, my heart pounding as the phone rang. When she answered, her voice was cautious, as if she didn't quite know how to approach the conversation. But as we talked, the tension began to ease. I told her everything, about Amy, about David, about what I had done. She listened quietly, and when I finished she didn't judge me. Instead she simply said, "I'm glad you called, Jack." Those 4 words were like a lifeline, pulling me back from the brink. We talked for hours, catching up on all the things we had missed in each other's lives. By the time we hung up I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It was a small step, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks I reached out to a few more friends, people I had neglected or pushed away during the chaos of my marriage's collapse. Some were hesitant, unsure of what to say to me after everything that had happened, but others welcomed me back without question, grateful that I was trying to rebuild my life. One of those friends was Mark, a colleague from work who had been close to both Amy and me. He had kept his distance after the breakup, probably because he didn't know how to navigate the minefield of our failed marriage. But when I called him, he agreed to meet for a drink. We met at a bar downtown, one of those places that felt both familiar and new at the same time. As we sipped our drinks and talked about work, life, and everything in between, I realized how much I had missed this simple, genuine conversation without the weight of betrayal hanging over it. At some point during the evening, Mark brought up Amy. He wasn't accusatory, just curious, wanting to know how I was handling everything. I hesitated, unsure of how much to share, but eventually I told him the truth. I told him about the revenge, the confrontation, and the aftermath. Mark listened, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he nodded slowly. "You went through hell, Jack, but you're still standing. That counts for something." His words stuck with me long after I left the bar. For so long I had been fixated on what I had lost, on the mistakes I had made. But Mark was right, I was still standing. And maybe that was something to hold on to. As the days turned into weeks, I started to find a rhythm in my new life. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and responsibilities. It was a way to keep my mind occupied, but it also gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in a long time. I also started to pursue old hobbies, things I had let fall by the wayside during my marriage. I dusted off my old guitar, started reading books I had always meant to get to, and even signed up for a photography class. It felt good to rediscover these parts of myself, to reconnect with the things that had once brought me joy. The house too began to feel different. I redecorated, slowly replacing the old with the new. It wasn't just about erasing Amy's presence. It was about creating a space that felt like mine, a place where I could heal and grow. There were still moments of doubt, times when the loneliness crept back in, and I wondered if I would ever truly move on. But I reminded myself that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a journey, one that I was just beginning. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch watching the sunset over the city, I realized that I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was there, growing stronger with each passing day. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time that uncertainty didn't scare me. I had faced the darkest parts of myself and I had survived. Now it was time to build something new, something better. And so, with the sun setting behind me and the city lights flickering on in the distance, I took a deep breath and made a promise to myself. I would keep moving forward, one step at a time, no matter how difficult it might be. I would rebuild my life, piece by piece, and in the process, I would find a way to forgive, not just Amy, but also myself. Because in the end, that was the only way to truly heal. The routine I had established was comforting, but it didn't take long for the monotony to set in. I found myself going through the motions, doing everything I was supposed to do to move on, but something still felt off. It was as if I was rebuilding my life on autopilot without truly living it. That realization hit me one evening when I was walking home from work. I had taken the long road, winding through the quieter neighborhoods to clear my head. The air was crisp, the sky tinged with the colors of an early autumn sunset. I was lost in thought, replaying the events of the past months, when I heard someone call my name. Jack. I turned around and was surprised to see a familiar face: Sarah, an old friend from college. We hadn't seen each other in years, not since before I married Amy. Seeing her now after all this time felt like a strange twist of fate. "Sarah, wow, it's been forever," I said, genuinely pleased to see her. She smiled, her eyes warm with recognition. "It really has. How have you been? What are you doing around here?" We stood there on the sidewalk, catching up on lost time. Sarah had moved back to the city a few months ago, after living abroad for several years. She was working as a freelance writer, traveling whenever she could. As she talked about her adventures, I couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. She had always been free-spirited, never afraid to take risks and chase after what she wanted. In contrast, my life felt so confined. When she asked about me, I hesitated. I wasn't sure how much to share. How do you sum up the dissolution of your marriage and the aftermath of revenge in a casual conversation? But something about Sarah's presence made it easy to open up. Maybe it was the way she listened, or the fact that she had known me before everything had gone wrong. "I've been through a lot," I finally said, giving her a brief overview of the past year. "But I'm working on rebuilding." "It's been a process." Sarah nodded, her expression understanding. "Life has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it? But it sounds like you're finding your way." "Trying to," I agreed, though I still wasn't sure if that was true. "What about you? Are you back here for good?" "For now," she said with a shrug. "But who knows, I'm just taking it one day at a time." There was a moment of silence as we stood there, both of us reflecting on the paths our lives had taken. Then Sarah glanced at her watch. "Hey, I was just about to grab dinner. Want to join me?" I hesitated, but only for a moment. The idea of going back to my empty house didn't hold much appeal, and I realized that I missed having company, someone to talk to who wasn't part of the painful memories I was trying to leave behind. "Sure," I said, surprising myself with how easily the word came out. "I'd like that." We ended up at a small, cozy restaurant not far from where we had run into each other. It was the kind of place that didn't try too hard, with mismatched chairs and handwritten menus. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost like stepping back in time to those carefree college days when we'd grab a bite to eat between classes. As we ate, the conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about everything and nothing: our jobs, the city, old friends. There was a comfort in it, a sense of familiarity that I hadn't realized I was missing. For a few hours I felt like the old Jack, the one who hadn't been hardened by betrayal and revenge. At one point, Sarah mentioned a photography project she was working on, and I found myself genuinely interested, asking questions and offering ideas. It was the first time in a long while that I felt truly engaged in a conversation, not just going through the motions. As the evening went on, I couldn't help but notice how easy it was to be around Sarah. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the simple pleasure of good company. It was a stark contrast to the tension and turmoil that had defined my life for so long. When the bill came, we both reached for it, but Sarah waved me off with a grin. "This one's on me, consider it a reunion celebration." "Thanks," I said, smiling back. "Next one's on me." As we left the restaurant, the night air had grown cooler, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. We walked side by side, the conversation continuing as we made our way back to where we had started. When we reached the spot where we had run into each other, Sarah turned to me with a smile. "This was really nice, Jack. I'm glad we bumped into each other." "Me too," I said, meaning it. "It was good to catch up." She hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Maybe we could do this again sometime?" "No pressure, just whenever." I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in a long time. "Yeah, I'd like that." We said our goodbyes, and I watched as she walked away, disappearing into the night. As I turned to head home, I couldn't help but smile. It had been a long time since I'd felt this way, like there was something to look forward to, something beyond the pain and regret. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the evening in my mind. It wasn't just the conversation or the company that had made it special. It was the realization that maybe, just maybe, I was ready to start letting new people into my life. That I was capable of moving on, of finding happiness again, even in the smallest of moments. The next day I woke up feeling different. The routine was still there, but it felt less like a crutch and more like a foundation, something to build on rather than hide behind. And as I went about my day, I found myself looking forward to what might come next, no longer dwelling on the past but cautiously optimistic about the future. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like that might be enough. Things began to fall into place after that evening with Sarah. I started meeting up with her regularly, sometimes for dinner, other times just for a walk or a coffee. It was nice to have someone in my life again, someone who wasn't connected to the tangled mess of my past. Our conversations were easy, unburdened by the weight of what had happened with Amy. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was starting to enjoy life again. But as much as I wanted to believe that I was moving on, the past had a way of creeping back in when I least expected it. It started with small things, an old song on the radio that Amy used to love, a fleeting memory triggered by a familiar scent. Each time I pushed those thoughts away, refusing to let them take hold. But the more I tried to ignore them, the more persistent they became. One evening, I was sitting in my living room, flipping through channels on the TV, when I saw it, a brief news segment about a company merger. The company wasn't important, but the man they interviewed was David, Amy's former lover. Seeing his face on the screen was like a punch to the gut. I hadn't thought about him in weeks, not since Amy had left. I had done my best to erase him from my mind, along with everything else connected to that part of my life. But now there he was, smiling confidently into the camera as if nothing had ever happened. As if he hadn't played a role in destroying my marriage. I turned off the TV, but it was too late. The memories came rushing back, each one more painful than the last. The anger I thought I had buried resurfaced, burning hot and fierce. How dare he go on with his life as if nothing had changed? How dare he smile, as if he hadn't left a trail of destruction in his wake? I tried to calm myself down, reminding myself that this was exactly what I had been trying to leave behind. I had moved on, or at least I was trying to. But seeing David again made it clear that I wasn't as far along as I'd thought. The wound was still there, raw and aching just beneath the surface. I knew I had a choice to make. I could let this drag me back into the darkness, let the anger and resentment consume me all over again. Or I could confront it, face the pain head on, and finally put it to rest. The next day, I made a decision. I needed closure, not just for what had happened with Amy, but for everything. I needed to confront David, not to seek revenge or retribution, but to close the door on that chapter of my life once and for all. It wasn't hard to find him. A quick search online led me to his office, a sleek building downtown where he worked as a financial consultant. I stood outside for a long time, staring up at the building, trying to summon the courage to go in. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk away, to forget I had ever seen that news segment, but I knew that if I didn't do this, the anger would fester, and I would never truly move on. Taking a deep breath, I walked inside and approached the receptionist. "I'm here to see David Turner," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, glancing up from her computer. "No," I admitted, "but I need to speak with him. It's personal." She hesitated, clearly unsure of whether to let me through, but something in my expression must have convinced her. She picked up the phone and dialed his extension. After a brief conversation, she nodded and directed me to his office on the 15th floor. The elevator ride up felt like it took an eternity. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing as I tried to figure out what I was going to say. By the time the doors opened, I still didn't have a plan. But there was no turning back now. I found David's office at the end of a long hallway. The door was open, and he was sitting behind a large desk, typing on his computer. He looked up when I walked in, and for a moment his expression was blank, as if he didn't recognize me. But then it clicked and I saw a flash of surprise followed by something else. Was it fear? "Jack," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." "Yeah," I replied, stepping into the office. "I'm sure it is." There was a long, uncomfortable silence as we sized each other up. He was the same as I remembered, polished, confident, the kind of man who always seemed to have everything under control. But there was something different about him now, a subtle tension that hadn't been there before. "I assume you're not here for a friendly chat," David finally said, breaking the silence. "No," I admitted, "I'm not." He nodded as if he had expected that. "So what do you want, Jack?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I began. I need to understand. Why did you do it? Why did you get involved with Amy knowing she was married?" David looked away, his jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer, but then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said quietly. "It just did. We got close at work, one thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were in too deep." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "You destroyed my marriage," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You ruined my life." David looked at me then, and for the first time I saw something like regret in his eyes. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm sorry, Jack, I really am, but I can't change what happened. All I can do is try to move forward." The anger that had been simmering inside me suddenly flared up. "Move forward? Do you think you can just move forward after everything you did? You think it's that easy?" David didn't flinch. "No, I don't. But what else can I do? I made a mistake, a huge mistake, and I've been paying for it ever since. But staying stuck in the past won't change anything. It won't undo the damage." I stared at him, my mind racing. This was the man who had shattered my world, and yet here he was, admitting his guilt, acknowledging his mistakes. It wasn't the apology I had expected, or even wanted. But there was something disarming about his honesty, something that made it hard to keep hating him. "You're right," I finally said, the words surprising even me. "We can't change the past, but I needed to hear you say that. I needed to hear you admit what you did." David nodded slowly. "I get that, and I'm glad you came to talk to me, Jack, I really am." There was another silence, but this one was different, less tense, more reflective. I realized that the anger that had been eating away at me for so long was starting to fade, replaced by something else. Acceptance, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. "I don't forgive you," I said, my voice firm but not angry. "But I'm done letting this control my life." David nodded again, understanding. "That's all I can ask for." I turned to leave, but before I reached the door I paused. "One more thing," I said, glancing back at him. "Stay out of my life. I don't ever want to see you again." "You won't," David promised. "I swear." With that, I walked out of his office, feeling a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, a lingering bitterness, but also a sense of closure. I had confronted my past, faced the man who had played such a pivotal role in my downfall, and come out the other side. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I realized that the weight I had been carrying for so long had finally started to lift. I wasn't completely free of it, but I was lighter and more at peace, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was truly ready to move on. The city lights flickered on around me as I walked to my car, a symbol of the new beginning I was finally ready to embrace. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I was done letting the shadows of the past define me. It was time to step into the light. The next few days passed in a blur. I went through the motions of daily life, but something had shifted inside me after my confrontation with David. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't consumed by thoughts of revenge or regret. There was a sense of finality, a closing of a chapter that had haunted me for too long. But as much as I wanted to believe that I had moved on, the repercussions of my actions were far from over. It started with a phone call. I was in the middle of making dinner when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered it anyway, thinking it might be work-related. "Jack?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost nervous. "Yes, this is Jack," I replied, not recognizing the voice immediately. "Who's this?" "It's Amy," she said quietly. Her name hit me like a punch to the chest. I hadn't spoken to Amy since the day she left, and hearing her voice now brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. "What do you want, Amy?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage. "We need to talk," she said, her tone serious. "It's important." I was silent for a moment, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to hang up, to avoid reopening old wounds, but another part of me was curious. What could she possibly have to say after all this time? "Fine," I said finally. "Where do you want to meet?" "There's a cafe on Maple Street," she suggested. "Tomorrow at noon?" "All right," I agreed, though I wasn't sure why. "I'll be there." The rest of the evening was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, my mind racing with possibilities. What did Amy want? Why now? I knew I wouldn't get any answers until the next day, but that didn't stop the questions from swirling in my head. The next day, I arrived at the cafe early, choosing a table near the back where we wouldn't be easily overheard. I ordered a coffee and waited, my nerves on edge. When Amy finally walked in, my breath caught in my throat. She looked the same as she always had, beautiful, composed, but there was something different about her. A weariness in her eyes, a heaviness in her step. She spotted me and made her way over, sitting down across from me without a word. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the silence between us thick with unspoken emotions. "You look good," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Thanks," I replied, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "So do you." She nodded, though I could tell she didn't believe it. After a few moments of awkward small talk, she got to the point. "I know about what you did," she said, her voice steady but soft. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "David told me," she clarified. "About the blackmail. About how you found out about us and used it against him." I exhaled slowly, leaning back in my chair. "And?" Amy looked down at her hands, twisting a napkin between her fingers. I don't know what to say, Jack. I'm not here to judge you. I'm not even here to accuse you of anything. I just needed to hear it from you. I needed to know if it was true." I met her gaze, my own expression unreadable. "It's true. I found out about the affair and I blackmailed him. I wanted revenge, Amy. I was angry, and I wanted him to suffer." Her face remained calm, but I could see the pain in her eyes. "And do you think it helped? Did it make you feel better?" I didn't answer right away. I had asked myself that question 100 times since everything had happened, and I still wasn't sure of the answer. At the time it did, but now, I don't know. She nodded as if she had expected that. "I left him, she said after a pause. "When I found out what you had done, I couldn't stay with him. I realized that we had both made a mess of things. We destroyed everything we had, everything we could have had." I looked down at the table, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Amy, but I guess I did." "I hurt you too," she said softly. "More than I can ever make up for." We sat in silence for a long time, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The weight of everything that had happened between us hung in the air, a reminder of how far we had fallen. "Why did you want to meet, Amy?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. "What do you want from me?" She sighed a deep, tired sound. "I don't want anything from you, Jack. I needed to talk to you. To see if there was any way we could find some sort of peace, some kind of closure." "Closure," I repeated, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "Do you really think that's possible after everything?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I want to try. I'm tired of carrying this around with me, Jack. It's eating me alive." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the truth in her words. She was hurting, just as much as I was. Maybe more. And in that moment I realized that as much as I had wanted revenge, as much as I had wanted to make her and David pay for what they had done, it hadn't brought me the satisfaction I thought it would. If anything, it had only deepened the wounds. "I'm tired too," I admitted, the words feeling like a confession. "I'm tired of being angry. I'm tired of holding on to the past, but I don't know how to let go." Amy reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than words ever could. "Maybe we can figure it out together," she said softly. "Even if we can't go back, maybe we can find a way to move forward." I didn't know if that was possible. I didn't know if we could ever truly heal from the damage we had done to each other. But as I sat there with Amy, our hands intertwined, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. We talked for a while longer, not about the past, but about the future. It was tentative and uncertain, but it was a step in the right direction. When we finally parted ways, I felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. As I walked home, the evening air cool against my skin, I realized that I wasn't alone in this. Amy and I had both made mistakes, and we had both suffered for them. But maybe, just maybe, We could help each other heal. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like it was possible. And that was enough. The weeks following my meeting with Amy were a strange blend of hope and uncertainty. We had agreed to keep in touch, not with any intention of rekindling our relationship, but to support each other as we tried to move forward. It was awkward at first after everything we had been through. Normalcy seemed like an impossible goal. But we were both committed to trying. Amy and I would meet up occasionally for coffee or lunch, sometimes even taking long walks through the park where we used to go when things were still good between us. Those walks were bittersweet, each familiar spot reminding us of a time before everything fell apart. But instead of shying away from the memories, we faced them head on. It was painful, but it was also cathartic. One day, as we were sitting on a bench near the lake, Amy turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" She asked quietly. I didn't have to ask what she meant. All the time, I admitted. But it doesn't do any good, does it? We can't change what happened. No, we can't, she agreed. But I think we can learn from it. I know I have. I looked at her, surprised by the conviction in her voice. What do you mean? She sighed, staring out at the water. I've spent so much time feeling guilty, Jack. Guilty for what I did to you, to us. I let that guilt control me, and it led me to make even more mistakes. But lately, I've been trying to forgive myself. I think that's the only way I can truly move on. Forgiveness. It was a concept I had wrestled with for months, both for Amy and for myself. Could I forgive her? Could I forgive myself for the things I had done in response? The blackmail, the anger, the desire for revenge, they had consumed me, turned me into someone I barely recognized. I don't know if I'm there yet, I said honestly. But I'm trying. Every day I'm trying. Amy smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting a mix of sadness and hope. That's all we can do, isn't it? Try. Maybe that's enough. We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts. It wasn't until later, as we were saying our goodbyes, that Amy mentioned something that took me by surprise. I've been thinking about moving, she said almost casually. Moving? I repeated, caught off guard. Where to? Out of state maybe, she replied. I need a fresh start, somewhere that doesn't hold so many memories. I've been looking for a job in Seattle. It's a great opportunity, and I think a change of scenery would do me good. Seattle. The thought of Amy leaving, of her no longer being a part of my daily life, hit me harder than I expected. But I understood her reasoning. This city was full of ghosts for both of us, and maybe getting away was what she needed to finally move on. When do you think you'll go? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Probably in a month or two, she said. I'm still finalizing the details, but it feels like the right move. I nodded slowly, processing the news. If that's what you need, then I think you should do it. I'll miss you though. Amy smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I'll miss you too, Jack, but we'll keep in touch, right? I don't want to lose what we've managed to rebuild. Of course, I promised. We'll keep in touch. As we hugged goodbye, I felt a mixture of emotions, sadness, yes, but also a sense of peace. Amy was moving on, and maybe that was exactly what she needed. Maybe it was what we both needed. The days that followed were strange. I found myself thinking a lot about the future, what it would look like without Amy in it, at least not in the way she had been before. It was daunting, but also strangely liberating. For the first time, I started to see the possibilities that lay ahead, instead of just the mistakes of the past. One evening, as I was walking through the city, I passed by a small bookstore. In the window was a sign advertising a local author's reading. On a whim, I decided to go in. The reading was already in progress, and I took a seat near the back, listening as the author spoke about his latest novel. It was a story about redemption, about a man who had lost everything and was trying to find his way back. The parallels to my own life weren't lost on me, and I found myself drawn into the story, the author's words resonating in a way I hadn't expected. After the reading, I approached the author, a man in his early 50s with kind eyes and a warm smile. We talked for a while, and I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't with anyone else, not even Amy. I've been through a lot, I admitted, and I'm trying to figure out how to move forward. Your book, it really spoke to me. The author nodded, his expression thoughtful. Life has a way of knocking us down, but it also has a way of giving us second chances, he said. It's up to us to recognize them, to take them when they come. His words stuck with me as I left the bookstore. A second chance. That was what I had been given, wasn't it? A chance to rebuild, to create a new life for myself, unburdened by the mistakes of the past. When I got home that night, I sat down at my computer and started writing. I didn't know where it would lead, but it felt good to put my thoughts into words, to start crafting a new narrative for my life. As the weeks passed, I found myself focusing more and more on the future. I started making plans, small ones at first, like taking up a new hobby or reconnecting with old friends. But as time went on, those plans grew bigger and more ambitious. I began to see that my life wasn't over. Far from it. In fact, it was just beginning. Amy left for Seattle a few weeks later. We had one last coffee before she went, and as we said our goodbyes, I felt a strange sense of closure. We had come full circle, from the pain and betrayal of the past to a tentative new beginning. As I watched her walk away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The past was still there, but it no longer defined me. I had made mistakes, yes, but I had also learned from them. And now, I was ready to move forward. That evening, I sat down at my computer again, the cursor blinking on the blank page in front of me. I didn't know exactly where my story would go, but I knew one thing for certain: it was mine to write. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what the future held. In the weeks that followed Amy's departure, I settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly normal. It was strange to think that just a few months ago, my life had been consumed by anger, betrayal, and a relentless need for revenge. Now those emotions were slowly being replaced by something else, something that felt like peace. I focused on my work at the detective agency, taking on new cases with a renewed sense of purpose. Each case was a reminder that I could still make a difference, that I could still do some good in the world despite everything that had happened. The work was challenging and sometimes frustrating, but it kept me grounded, and for the first time in a long time, I found myself enjoying it. One day, as I was sifting through case files at the office, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. We had drifted apart after college, our lives taking different paths, but I had never forgotten the bond we once shared. The message was simple: "Hey Jack, it's been a while. How about catching up over a drink?" I stared at the screen for a moment, memories flooding back. This friend had been there for me during some of the best times of my life, before the complications, before the betrayals. The idea of reconnecting was both exciting and nerve-wracking. But I knew it was time. Time to start rebuilding the relationships I had neglected. Time to start living again. "Sure," I replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Let's do it." That evening we met at a quiet bar downtown, the kind of place where you could actually hear yourself think. My friend Matt hadn't changed much. He still had the same easygoing smile, the same sharp wit. We fell into conversation easily, reminiscing about old times, and catching up on the years we had missed. At one point, after a few drinks, Matt leaned back in his chair and gave me a thoughtful look. "You know, Jack, I've been thinking about starting my own business," he said. "Something small, something meaningful. I was wondering if you'd be interested in partnering up." I blinked, surprised by the offer. "What kind of business?" I asked, intrigued. "Something related to security," Matt explained. "But not just physical security. I'm talking about digital, personal, the whole package. I think there's a real need for a service that helps people protect themselves in all aspects of their lives, especially these days." I considered his words, the idea slowly taking shape in my mind. It was different from the detective work I was used to, but it wasn't entirely unrelated. In fact, it felt like a natural extension of what I was already doing, helping people, solving problems, and making them feel safe. "I like the sound of that," I said finally, a sense of excitement building in my chest. "Tell me more." Over the next hour, we brainstormed ideas, discussed potential clients, and sketched out a rough business plan on a napkin. The more we talked, the more the idea resonated with me. This wasn't just about starting a new venture, it was about starting a new chapter in my life. By the time we left the bar, we had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it would take time to get off the ground, but it was something I could pour my energy into, something positive and forward-looking. In the days that followed, Matt and I began laying the groundwork for our new business. We spent hours researching, meeting with potential partners, and developing a brand that we believed in. It was hard work, but it was also incredibly fulfilling. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was building something that mattered, something that could make a difference. As our business started to take shape, I noticed changes in myself as well. I was more focused and more optimistic. The anger and bitterness that had consumed me for so long were beginning to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose and hope. I was no longer defined by what had happened with Amy. I was defined by what I was doing now, by the person I was becoming. One afternoon, as I was working late at the office, I received an unexpected call. It was from Amy. "Hey Jack," she said, her voice warm but with a hint of nervousness. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "I'm doing well, actually. Things are good." "That's great to hear," she replied, relief evident in her tone. "Seattle's been good for me too. I'm starting to feel like myself again." "I'm glad," I said sincerely. "You deserve that." There was a brief pause before she spoke again. "I heard about your new business," she said, a note of pride in her voice. "Matt told me." "It sounds amazing, Jack. I'm really happy for you." "Thanks, Amy," I said, feeling a swell of gratitude. "It's still early days, but it feels right. It feels like I'm finally on the right path." "You are," she said softly. "I'm really proud of you, Jack, and I'm glad we can still talk like this." "Me too," I agreed. "It means a lot." We talked for a little while longer, catching up on each other's lives. It was a different kind of conversation than we used to have, no longer tinged with the pain of the past, but filled with the hope of the future. When we finally hung up, I felt lighter and more at peace. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how far I had come. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but I was no longer the man who had been consumed by anger and revenge. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned from his mistakes and was ready to embrace the future. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. The next few months passed in a blur of activity. Matt and I poured everything we had into our new business, and it was starting to pay off. We landed a few key clients early on, and word began to spread about the services we offered. It was exhilarating, watching something we had created from scratch take off and grow, but it wasn't just the business that was changing. I was changing too. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. The darkness that had hovered over me for so long was lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose and fulfillment. I was building something meaningful, something that gave me a reason to get up in the morning. One day, after a particularly successful meeting with a new client, Matt and I decided to celebrate. We headed to a nearby restaurant, the kind of place where the food was good, the atmosphere was relaxed, and you could take a moment to savor life. As we clinked glasses, Matt gave me a knowing look. "You're different, you know that?" he said, a grin tugging at his lips. "A good different, like you've finally found your groove." I laughed, taking a sip of my drink. "Yeah, I feel different. It's like, I've let go of the past. I'm not carrying that weight around anymore." Matt nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It shows. I'm happy for you, man. You deserve this." "Thanks, Matt," I said, meaning it. This business, this fresh start, it's exactly what I needed. As the night went on, we talked about the future, about the potential we saw in our business, and about the lives we were building. It was one of those conversations that left you feeling inspired, like anything was possible. But it wasn't just work that was on my mind. In the back of my head, I had been thinking about something else, something more personal. I had spent so much time rebuilding my professional life that I hadn't given much thought to my personal one. But now, with the business on solid ground and my heart finally healing, I was starting to wonder if maybe it was time to open myself up to the possibility of love again. It wasn't an easy thought. The idea of trusting someone, of being vulnerable, was terrifying after everything I had been through. But it was also exciting. The thought of meeting someone new, of starting a new chapter in my life with a clean slate, it was something I hadn't dared to hope for in a long time. A few days later, I found myself standing in front of a coffee shop, nervously checking my reflection in the glass window. I was meeting someone. Her name was Grace, a friend of a friend who had suggested we might hit it off. It was just coffee, just a casual meeting, but it felt like a big step. As I walked in, I spotted her right away. She was sitting by the window, her brown hair falling in soft waves around her face, a warm smile on her lips as she looked up from her book. There was something about her that immediately put me at ease, like I had known her for much longer than a few seconds. "Jack?" she asked as I approached, standing up to greet me. "That's me," I replied, returning her smile. "And you must be Grace." "That's me," she echoed with a laugh, and the sound of it was like a breath of fresh air. We ordered our drinks and settled into a comfortable conversation. It was easy, easier than I'd expected. Grace was funny, smart, and had a way of looking at the world that was both optimistic and grounded. I found myself relaxing, enjoying the moment without the usual tension that came with first dates. As we talked, I realized that I was genuinely interested in getting to know her. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the simple pleasure of connecting with another person. It was something I hadn't experienced in a long time, and it felt good. As the conversation flowed, we discovered common interests, books, hiking, and a love for old movies. It was like finding a kindred spirit, someone who saw the world in a way that resonated with me. And as we talked, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected, sharing stories and thoughts that I hadn't told anyone in years. Before I knew it, hours had passed, and the coffee shop was starting to close. Grace looked at me with a smile that was both shy and hopeful. "I had a really great time, Jack. I'd love to do this again sometime." "I'd love that too," I replied, meaning it more than I could express. How about next weekend? We could grab dinner, maybe catch a movie? Sounds perfect, she said, her eyes lighting up. As we walked out of the coffee shop together, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. This was new, this was different, but it felt right. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel hopeful about the future, not just professionally, but personally as well. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Grace and I started seeing each other regularly, and each date only reinforced what I had felt during that first meeting, that she was someone special, someone I could see a future with. We took things slowly, both of us aware of the importance of building something real and lasting. At the same time, the business continued to grow. Matt and I hired a few new employees, expanded our services, and even started considering opening a second office in a neighboring city. It was exciting, watching our vision come to life, and I felt a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I found myself standing on the balcony of my apartment, looking out at the city lights. The skyline was beautiful, a mix of old and new, just like my life had become. As I stood there, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. The pain of the past was still there, but it was no longer the defining force in my life. I had moved on, built something new, and in the process I had rediscovered who I was. I wasn't just a man who had been betrayed. I was someone who had faced that betrayal, learned from it, and come out stronger on the other side. As I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs, I realized something important. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to control me. I was free to create a new story, one that was filled with hope, love, and endless possibilities. With Grace by my side and a future that felt bright and open, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next. This was my new beginning, and I was going to make the most of it. Just as everything in my life seemed to be falling into place, the past found a way to knock on my door once again. It started with a phone call. I was at the office finalizing some details on a big new contract when my phone buzzed on the desk. The number was unfamiliar, but something told me to pick it up. "Jack Stevenson," I answered, my mind still half focused on the document in front of me. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. "Jack, it's Amy." My heart skipped a beat and I leaned back in my chair, trying to keep my voice steady. "Amy, I didn't expect to hear from you. How are you?" "I'm okay," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "I need to talk to you about something. It's important." A wave of emotions hit me, surprise, curiosity, and a hint of anxiety. We had both moved on, or so I thought. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Sure," I said after a moment. "What's going on? Can we meet in person?" she asked, her tone unusually serious. "There's something I need to tell you, and it's better if we talk face to face." My mind raced. What could be so important that she had to see me in person? "All right," I agreed, though I was still hesitant. "When and where? Tomorrow evening, at the park near your old apartment?" she suggested. "Yeah, I'll be there," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. When we hung up, I stared at my phone, my thoughts spinning. Why now? What could possibly be so urgent that she felt the need to bring it up after all this time? Part of me wanted to cancel, to avoid reopening old wounds, but my curiosity got the better of me. The next evening, I made my way to the park, the familiar surroundings bringing back a flood of memories. I hadn't been there in a long time. It had been a place of peace for me once, a place where Amy and I had spent countless hours together, long before things had fallen apart. I found her sitting on a bench, looking out at the small pond where ducks floated lazily in the water. She looked different, more tired perhaps, and there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Jack," she said softly as I approached. She stood up, giving me a small, tentative smile. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course," I replied, sitting down next to her. "What's going on, Amy?" She hesitated, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. "I didn't want to bring this up, but I've been thinking about it for a long time. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you months ago." My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. "Go on," I urged gently. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the water in front of us. "After everything happened, after you found out about the affair and we ended things, I was a mess. I couldn't think straight, couldn't make sense of what I'd done. But there was something else, something that happened right before we split." I frowned, trying to piece together what she was saying. "What do you mean?" "I found out I was pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was right before everything came crashing down. I didn't know how to tell you, and then, well, you know what happened." The world seemed to tilt for a moment, my thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. Pregnant? Amy had been pregnant? "What happened?" I asked, my voice strained. "I lost the baby," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "The stress, the guilt, everything. It was too much. I didn't know how to tell you then. And by the time I could even think about it, we were already done. But I couldn't move on without telling you, without letting you know. I stared at her, my emotions a tangled mess of shock, grief, and anger. Amy, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me help? I was scared, she admitted, wiping at her eyes. I was scared of what it would mean, scared of what you would think, and then it was too late. I didn't want to drag you back into something so painful when you were trying to move on. I didn't know what to say. The news hit me like a freight train, and I struggled to process the enormity of it. A part of me wanted to lash out, to ask why she had kept something so important from me, but another part understood the fear and confusion she must have felt. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of what she had told me settling between us. Finally, I found my voice. I wish you had told me, Amy. I wish we could have gone through that together. I know, she said, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry, Jack. I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know. I needed to be honest with you, even if it's too late. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the pain she was carrying. It was different from mine, but it was real. And despite everything that had happened, despite all the anger and betrayal, I found that I could forgive her. Not because it was easy, but because holding on to the past would only keep us both trapped. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly, the words heavy with meaning. She nodded, relief washing over her face. I know we've both moved on, but I didn't want to keep this from you. I hope you can find peace with it, Jack. I hope we both can. I think we can, I replied, feeling a strange sense of closure. It'll take time, but I think we can. As we parted ways, I felt a mix of emotions, grief for what could have been, relief that the truth was finally out, and a sense of finality that I hadn't realized I needed. The chapter with Amy was truly over now, in every sense. When I got home that night, I sat on my balcony staring out at the city lights. The revelation had shaken me, but it had also brought something I hadn't expected: closure. I could finally put that part of my life behind me fully and completely, and with that closure came a sense of freedom. I was no longer defined by the mistakes and pain of the past. I was free to move forward, to embrace the new life I was building with Grace, and to let go of the ghost that had haunted me for so long. Tomorrow, I would continue with my life, with the business, with Grace, with everything that lay ahead. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel the weight of the past one last time before letting it go, knowing that whatever came next, I was ready. The days following my conversation with Amy were a whirlwind of emotions. I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened: our marriage, the affair, the painful truths that had finally come to light. It felt like I had been carrying a heavy weight for so long, and now that it was lifted, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. But life doesn't wait for you to catch your breath. The business was busier than ever, and Grace was becoming a bigger part of my life. Yet something still felt unfinished, like there was one last piece of the puzzle I hadn't yet placed. That piece came in the form of a phone call from Matt. "Jack, you've got to see this," he said, his voice tense. "Check your email. I just forwarded you something." I opened my laptop and pulled up the email. The subject line read, "Urgent, you need to see this." My stomach knotted as I clicked on the attachment, which was a scanned document, an official-looking letterhead from the law firm that had handled the divorce between Amy and me. As I read the contents, my blood ran cold. It was a legal notice addressed to Amy, stating that an anonymous party had filed a complaint against her, alleging that she had committed fraud during our divorce proceedings. The document claimed that she had hidden assets and failed to disclose significant financial information, something I had never suspected. What the hell is this? I muttered to myself, scanning the document again. I called Matt back immediately. "I just got this in the mail," Matt explained, his voice grim. "Someone's going after Amy hard, and it doesn't look good." "Do you think she really did it?" I asked, still in shock. "I don't know, Jack, but whoever's behind this, they're serious. This could ruin her." I felt a mix of anger and confusion. Amy had wronged me in so many ways, but this was something I hadn't expected, and the fact that it was anonymous made it even more suspicious. Was someone out for revenge? I knew I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me. That evening, I drove to Amy's apartment. We hadn't seen each other since our meeting in the park, and I wasn't sure how she'd react to my sudden appearance. But I needed to know the truth. When she opened the door, her face paled. "Jack, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," I said, holding up the printed copy of the email. "About this." She took the paper from me, her eyes widening as she read it. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand shaking. This can't be happening." "So it's true?" I asked, my voice low. "Did you really hide assets during the divorce?" Amy looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes. "Jack, I never wanted to hurt you like this. I was desperate. After everything that happened, I was scared of losing everything. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I didn't think it would come to this. I felt a surge of anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. Who do you think is behind this? Who would do something like this? I don't know, she said, shaking her head. But I've been getting these strange calls and now this. Someone's trying to destroy MME. I thought back to all the people who had been hurt by what had happened, myself included. But this went beyond simple revenge. This was calculated, cold, and relentless, and whoever was behind it wasn't just out to hurt Amy, they wanted to ruin her completely. What are you going to do? I asked, not sure why I still cared, but unable to walk away from the situation. I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. I've already hired a lawyer, but I'm terrified, Jack. This could destroy my career, my life, everything. I stood there, torn between my lingering resentment and the undeniable humanity of the situation. Amy had made her bed, but this was something else entirely. I don't know who's doing this, but I'll try to find out, I said, surprising even myself with the words. She looked at me, a mix of shock and gratitude in her eyes. Why would you help me after everything I did? Because this isn't justice, Amy. It's something much darker, I replied. And despite everything, I'm not going to stand by and let someone destroy you. As I left her apartment that night, I knew I had just walked into a whole new level of complications. But deep down I also knew that this was something I needed to see through, if not for Amy's sake, then for my own. The past had a way of catching up with you, and maybe this was my chance to finally put it all to rest once and for all. The days that followed were filled with unease, as if the air itself had thickened with tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. My investigation into who was behind the attack on Amy's life was slow, but the pieces were beginning to come together. I spent hours going through old records, reaching out to contacts and digging into Amy's past. Whoever was behind this had access to sensitive information, details that only a few people could have known. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that this wasn't just about money or revenge. This was personal. One evening, as I was poring over a stack of documents in my office, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Matt. I've got something. Meet me at the usual spot. The usual spot was a small, nondescript bar on the outskirts of town where we'd often met to discuss sensitive matters. I grabbed my keys and headed out, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, Matt was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a drink in hand. He looked up as I approached, his expression serious. What did you find? I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. He pushed a folder across the table toward me. I did some digging. There's a connection we missed, a name that kept coming up in the background checks I ran on Amy's colleagues. I opened the folder and scanned the contents. It was a dossier on a man named Robert Fields, a high-level executive at the firm where Amy worked. According to the documents, Robert had a history with Amy that went back years, long before she had even met me. Who is this guy? I asked, frowning. Robert Fields, Matt replied. He's been quietly pulling strings behind the scenes. I found emails between him and Amy from years ago, long before her affair with her colleague. They were close, too close. A cold realization began to settle in. You think he's the one behind all this? The lawsuit, the harassment, everything? It looks that way, Matt said grimly. And it gets worse. I found a series of transactions, large sums of money being funneled into offshore accounts in Amy's name. But the accounts were set up by Robert, not her. He's been setting her up for a fall this entire time. I sat back, my mind reeling. But why? What's his motive? Matt leaned forward, lowering his voice. Revenge. Robert and Amy had an affair years ago. When she broke it off, he never got over it. He's been biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy her. The pieces clicked into place. Robert had orchestrated the entire thing, manipulating events from the shadows, setting Amy up for financial ruin, and using me as a pawn in his game. And all the while, Amy had been completely unaware. What do we do now? I asked, feeling a surge of anger mixed with a grim determination. We expose him? Matt said, his voice steady. I've already compiled the evidence. We take this to the authorities and make sure he pays for what he's done. I nodded, knowing that this was the only way to end it. But as I left the bar that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a legal battle. This was about justice, not just for Amy, but for myself as well. Robert had tried to destroy both of us, but now it was time to turn the tables. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and legal maneuvers. Matt and I worked tirelessly to build our case, gathering every scrap of evidence we could find. I contacted Amy and told her everything, and though she was shaken, she agreed to help us bring Robert down. Finally, the day came when we confronted Robert at his office. Amy and I stood side by side as we handed over the evidence to the authorities, watching as they led Robert away in handcuffs. His face was a mask of cold fury, but there was nothing he could do. His carefully constructed plan had crumbled, and he was finished. As we walked out of the building, Amy turned to me, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you, Jack, for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to," I replied, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. "We're both free now. It's time to move on." She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I think you're right." We parted ways that day, knowing that this was the true end of our story. There would be no more secrets, no more lies. The past was finally behind us. As I drove home, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. The ghosts of my past had been laid to rest, and for the first time in a long time, I could look to the future with hope. Life would go on, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. The storm had passed, and though the scars would remain, they were a part of me now, reminders of the battles I had fought and the lessons I had learned, and in the end, that was enough.